I want to recommend some short philosophy books for you today. The idea is that these are all books that you could read in a day. These are books that you don't have to be an academic philosopher to get something out of, and they have to be books that I think are pretty good. Two quick caveats though, because I know some people are going to have a problem with the premise of this video. First off, just because you could read these in the day doesn't mean that you have to. And if you need to slow down your reading pace in order to get more out of the books, I encourage you to do so. The second thing is that some people will say that you shouldn't ever read any philosophy books in a day because you need to read them nice and slowly. In a couple of videos where I've talked about what I like to call the art of reading, how to read better, and especially how to read difficult works like philosophy, I talk about this a little bit. I'll link those videos down below, but very briefly, my idea is that these are books that you're going to want to read more than once, and that actually the first time you read them, you should be okay reading very quickly and not worrying about the details. Because what you're trying to do is look for the structure of the book, the sort of thrust or narrative of the dialectic, and that's going to help you sort of grasp those details when you go back and do your deep, slow reading later. The first book I want to recommend is by Miranda Fricker, and it's called Epistemic Injustice. This is a work of fairly contemporary philosophy. It was published in 2007. When I was looking up information about this book to refresh my own memory about it, I found a stat that suggested that this book has been cited almost 10,000 times in academic books and articles in the last 15 years, which is really remarkable. This book made a very big splash when it was published. Fricker wants to talk about the ethics of knowing. And that sounds very complicated already, but one of the benefits of the book is that she can introduce this idea really simply. I read it as a really new graduate student. However, I think that undergrads could read this. I think even if you are like a really dedicated high schooler, you might be able to get something out of this too. The two key insights in Fricker's book are the ideas of hermeneutical injustice and testimonial injustice. The idea that in hermeneutical injustice, it's the injustice of not having the concepts that you need to make sense of your own experience or to make sense of the world. And testimonial injustice, which is when others do not appropriately credit people when they give their testimony, when they speak to their experiences or what they have seen, or even just facts through the relevant knowledge acquisition methods. For instance, sometimes we dismiss someone's opinion because they're just simply too young. Even though this book is under 200 pages, I think it's exactly 199 pages, Fricker is detailed, she is analytical, but she's talking about topics that analytic philosophers for a long time ignored, and I think that makes it a little bit easier for a wider audience to come in and start reading this. Analytic philosophy is not always the most accessible to an outside audience, so this is sort of a remarkable feat for any philosopher. I would especially recommend this to anyone who already has some interest in epistemology or generally is wondering about how we can know things about the world, or for people who are looking for gentle ways to read some feminist philosophy without having to go through the really theory-heavy stuff that might be a more standard recommendation. My second recommendation is Plato's Apology. Now, Plato's Apology can actually be found in a little 5-dialogue set published by Hackett, just called 5 Dialogues. And you could actually read all 5 of those dialogues in one day because they are all very short. But it would be hard for me to summarize all 5 of them for you. And also, even though you could read them all in a day, reading one is going to drain you enough that you might want to take a little bit of time and maybe go read something that's a little more fun in between reading different dialogues. The reason I want to focus on the Apology is because it is a text that is often used in introductory philosophy classes, along with Euthyphro, which is another dialogue that is in that little collection. There will be a link to that and all the other books down below. The Apology tells the story of Socrates as he is going on trial before the assembly in Athens because he is being charged with atheism and with corrupting the youth. And what we see is a passionate defense of philosophy, but also of free thinking and standing by your convictions. Because of the dramatic setting and I would say the inspirational character of Socrates, this makes it really great for maybe slightly younger readers who are trying to read philosophy for the first time. So if you're a high schooler or you know someone who's in high school who's been interested in philosophy, reading the Apology can be a really great first step. And it's a text that I like to return to regularly, and every time I return to it, my heart swells a bit and I feel inspired. My third recommendation is The Burnout Society by Byung-Chul Han. This is another contemporary philosopher, though this is a South Korean philosopher by way of Berlin, I believe. Byung-Chul Han is writing from a different mode and tradition than I was educated in. My PhD is in analytic philosophy, where I focused on logic and language. Only later did I acquire a love for history. But Byung-Chul Han is really writing from an existentialist and phenomenological and Marxist tradition. This creates two difficulties. One is that this is probably the hardest read out of anything that I am recommending, but it's also one of the shorter reads. I believe it's under 100 pages. And also, even though it is very difficult, certain aspects of the Burnout Society do make themselves very clear to the reader, even on the first read. The second difficulty this raises is that I'm really not the best person to teach you about that kind of stuff. Even in a really informal video like this, I would probably make a fool of myself. So I am going to link down below to a video from Overthink. They are a philosophy podcast, two philosophy professors. So in that video, Ellie Anderson tries to explain the Burnout Society in a way that I think does a really nice job. And so I will link that down below. If you want to explore that topic or Byung-Chul Han's work, go check out their podcast. This obviously is just a great recommendation for people who are interested in what's going on in contemporary philosophy, especially in Europe, those who are interested in Heidegger or the Heideggerian tradition or phenomenology in general, and of course, anyone who has an interest in Marxism. It's very rare for a philosophy book to make it to, say, the New York Times bestseller list, or even to be the kind of book that every bookstore wants to stock. Especially for contemporary philosophy. Most bookstores, when they have a philosophy section, they mostly carry classics, which is fine, but it means that we contemporary philosophers have a harder time finding a bigger audience. One philosopher that did this really well was Harry Frankfurt. I will say the name of this book one time because I do kind of worry that YouTube will start flagging me as a channel that swears too much. So the title of this book is On Bullshit. Harry Frankfurt's book is a blast to read. It is genuinely fun. Frankfurt is trying to figure out this phenomenon we will call BS. What he wants to do is separate BS from, say, simply lying. And he ends up having to go through a kind of meditation on our relationship to the truth. And the difference between someone who is BSing and is lying is actually that the liar cares about the truth, but chooses to deceive you, where the person who is BSing, they simply don't have any regard for the truth at all. I remember around 2016, 2015, everyone that I knew in academia wanted to talk about post-truth, living in a post-truth age, and I read a lot of that stuff, and I don't think almost any of it ended up being much more insightful than what Frankfurt wrote. Now, the next book that I'm recommending is actually 256 pages. However, a lot of that is a bibliography. So if we're ignoring the bibliography, you will see that this book clearly meets my criteria laid out. I just want to note it so that nobody decides to get angry at me down in the comments. That book is Know-It-All Society by Michael Lynch. Michael Lynch is a professor at the University of Connecticut. Michael Lynch was also on my dissertation committee. I consider Michael a friend, and when I was working on my PhD, his influence was certainly important to me. Michael pivoted to doing more public philosophy around the time that I met him. He started out with a book called The Internet of Us, which is also worth reading. But Know-It-All Society is really trying to diagnose this problem of how do you maintain both intellectual humility and having real convictions. Now, Michael is mostly interested in how this plays out in the political sphere, but if you think about it, that tension between being humble and having convictions actually is going to play out in almost every sphere of life when you are dealing with people of different faiths or dealing with people, even people who have different aesthetic preferences and want to argue about them. When any kind of dispute that you get into, how do you stand your ground while also remaining open to persuasion and ultimately being able to respect your interlocutors? One danger, though, is that you get so swept up in the idea of intellectual humility that you end up assuming false neutrality. But false neutrality is just as dangerous as being overly confident, and Michael is trying to thread that needle. Now, I think that this is a problem that still remains to be solved, but Michael is trying to solve it, and he's trying to do that through some of his public writing. This book also won a prize, which I love the name of. I have to actually write it all down to get it right, but it's the George Orwell Award for Distinguished Contribution to Honesty and Clarity in Public Language. That is maybe not the most elegantly named prize, but it is a very good description of the kind of work that Michael is trying to do. And finally, it would not be a philosophy video for me if I probably didn't bring up the Stoics. So let me bring up one essay by Seneca, which is published as its own volume, and that is On the Shortness of Life. I'm going to link down to my preferred edition, which is in a larger collection. It's a little more expensive, but I'll also link to a cheaper edition if you just want to read that essay. This is one of the most inspirational works of philosophy that has ever been written. There is this idea amongst us that life is too short. It's too short for the kind of work that we want to do, and we can never accomplish it. But Seneca actually says, no, that is not true. And it's funny when you think about the context of this, because he's writing this letter to his father-in-law. And he's saying, no, life is not short. The problem is that you waste it. The problem is that you don't make good use of your time. He compares some men's lives to a sailor who decides to go out on a long voyage, and he goes out to sea, and he's battled by the winds, and he's whipped around, and he never goes anywhere, and then he comes back to shore years later. Now, in some sense, he went on a long voyage, but it was a voyage to nowhere, and that's how many of us live our lives. Seneca's essay is a call to action, and as I said, it is just incredibly inspirational. That's the kind of essay that you could really read in an afternoon, and I think it's the kind of essay that once you read it, you start looking at the entire world differently.